Hello again, everybody. Back with a review of Chapter 3, which is entitled The English Come to Stay, and so about some of the different English attempts to settle in what is now the United States. And it starts out on page 61 talking about Captain John Smith and how the whole Pocahontas thing did not really happen, or very, very, very small chance that it did happen, or if it did, it's pretty disturbing because the girl was like 10 or 11 years old with a grown man, so we hope that it didn't happen. But John Smith just happened in it. You can read his diaries online. Those have been published free through some various museums, and he happens to have a very similar story many times over. So Pocahontas, she is a historic figure. He certainly is very much a historical figure as well, both important to colonial Jamestown, but they didn't get together. So putting to rest that myth. But John, again, very important commander there, and Pocahontas was the daughter of Chief Powhatan. From there it goes to the English settling in with King James. James replaced Elizabeth I because she was the Virgin Queen, Virginia named after her. So she didn't have any kids because that's the result of her life there. And so they have to find the nearest male relative, so they get her cousin from Scotland, King James. He was already cousin of Scotland. He comes down, he's now cousin, he was cousin of Scotland. He was king of Scotland. He's going to be king of England as well. And he allows these royal charters to be given, basically like a contract, a permission for Jamestown to be established. Jamestown, therefore, will be named after King James I of England, saying King James of the King James Bible. So a lot goes on during that time. So they head off for Jamestown with their permission from the king. It's going to be a royal colony under England. They land in 1607. So Jamestown survives. It's the oldest English settlement. So it's not the oldest permanent settlement in what is the United States, because we talked about that with St. Augustine, and actually just recently in North Carolina they found some evidence of the Spanish having settlements there before Jamestown was established. But Jamestown's the first permanent English settlement, and it barely survives. The location of it, it's there. So Roanoke had been just a little farther south of what this image shows. But here you've got Jamestown, the James River. Difficult conditions when they arrive because it's going to be the spring, summertime. As we know, it's hot there. They have mosquitoes. There's drought going on. So they will barely survive. It's only men and boys who arrive. There are no women who arrive at all. And only about a third of them are alive a few months later in January. Huge amounts of disease, so malaria, things like dysentery, and this isn't great PR either. And over the years, not many of them will survive. So a deadly place to be there in Jamestown with the various diseases. Just last, I think it was about a year ago, and from the time of this recording at least, which I may use for future classes, I think it was in 2013, that they found evidence of, from a skeletal remains in Jamestown, of cannibalism that occurred during one of the rougher times with a lack of food, and a 14-year-old girl who died, and they named her Jane. But if you Google Jamestown and cannibalism, it'll show her image and the evidence of how they saw that she, that her brains had been eaten. So very disturbing times, and not really a happy Disney World type of environment whatsoever. It discusses the relations with the Native Americans, Chief Powhatan, and the Powhatan tribe named for him. This is the guy who was Pocahontas' dad. And kind of a love-hate relationship like we talked about in Chapter 2. Sometimes the Indians will rely on the colonists for things like weapons, but the colonists certainly try to take advantage of the Native Americans by making them grow food. They have different perspectives. One of the major things that's going to be hard for Indians and Europeans to understand is the concept of property. That in Europe they're used to private property. The Indians have communal property. It belongs area. They'll fight for it against other native tribes at times, but there's not a deed to say you own this property, and so that individual private property that the Europeans valued, and they didn't get the concept of that communal property as much. Different views on the roles of gender. A lot of the Europeans thought men were lazy in the native tribes because their job was to go out and do a lot of the hunting, which for rich men in Europe was a game of sport, and it was Native American women who did a lot of the growing. So a lot of misunderstandings that happen, but sometimes they get along during that time. Mentions on page 66 how tobacco is discovered, very key, because this is going, ironically, tobacco, which kills, will cause Jamestown to survive. It's going to be the staple crop. People are still addicted to it in the 2000s. They certainly became addicted to it in the 1600s. And that tobacco strain that grew well in Virginia was introduced by John Rolfe, the same man who married Pocahontas. So tobacco is going to become really, really key. They then develop other colonies in that area, Maryland, so right above that Chesapeake Bay area, that whole funky water shape here, the Chesapeake Bay, was intended originally to be a refuge for Catholics, named after Queen Mary I, who was a Catholic queen. Lord Baltimore was Catholic. Catholics were not allowed to freely practice in England in the 1600s. So this is what the intent was. But again, just like money-making people can be pretty greedy today, all those tobacco farmers, they wanted money. They pretty much overrun Maryland, and Maryland will be a lot like Virginia in terms of being a place where the goal is to make a lot of money through tobacco. Then it gets into the emergence of slavery, a tricky issue because notice that the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. Were they slaves? Some evidence says, yet basically on the census, that's the only real documentation that 16 Negroes arrived. There's not, your book kind of indicates that they're 100% sure that those were slaves, but they may not have been. They may have been somehow treated freely in Virginia, but Africans are going to arrive in 1619 in Virginia for the first time, and what's going to happen is that they're going to replace indentured servants, and slavery is going to change in Virginia. Slavery around since humans first existed, but what's going to happen here in the New World is that slavery is going to change, whereas historically it had been war captives or people of a different religion. Now it's going to become increasingly race-based. So we're getting that introduction of a sad chapter here in colonial Virginia. Goes on page 72, talk about the social order in Virginia. And what you see here is it's going to be different. Virginia is or the Chesapeake area, I'm saying Virginia, but that Chesapeake Bay area, Virginia and Maryland, where so many people are moving, male-dominated society. 84% of the people there are men, only 16% women. So a male-dominated society in the Chesapeake, and these are not big family units. Almost 50% of the people are just these little, maybe a married couple with one kid. Over 25% is just one person, usually a man, occasionally maybe a female indentured servant, just a man who goes to strike wealth on his own. So it's not going to be the same family unit dynamics that you have in the New England colonies. So after this, it does go on to the New England, which is very, very different. And people get confused about the concept of New England, what that is. New England, when we're talking about that, it's the Northeast United States. So what's now today, like Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, those places are New England instead of the Chesapeake. And New England is going to be settled by the Puritans. The Puritans, they're kind of like hardcore Protestants. England has the Anglican Church at the time. So when the Anglican Church was formed by King Henry VIII, you had Protestants on one side. Protestants were people who protested the ways of the Catholic Church. It was a movement started in the early 1500s by Martin Luther. And you had Catholics. We'll start with the Catholics then. Catholics more people were leaving the Catholic Church. Catholic means universal by definition, so there had just been this universal church controlled by Rome. A lot of people were upset because the Catholic Church had become very absorbed in money. There was a lot of corruption, but Catholics were teaching that they wouldn't allow common people to read the Bible. The Bible was only produced in Latin, and that only church leaders, so Latin is not a language that everybody's growing up reading, you had to be really educated, but only church leaders were allowed to interpret what the Bible says. So common people couldn't read it on their own. They thought common people were too dumb to interpret the complicated scriptures. And they were starting to teach that salvation came by a little faith, but that works, good deeds, were a major part of salvation. Well, the Protestant church comes along, and the Protestant church says, no, you're saved by faith alone. Only faith and God's grace can save you. You can't do good works. You can't have one person or a church leader's kind of making up the rules as you go. Everyone should be able to have access to the scriptures or the Bibles. The Anglican Church falls a little bit in between. It's definitely not Catholic, but it's not fully Protestant either. There's still a lot of rituals involved in the Anglican Church. But this was the official Church of England. So now, in England, if you wanted to have full opportunity, you had to be a member of the Anglican Church. So Anglican Church equals Church of England, same thing. All right, the Puritans then, these are people who say, we think the Anglican Church is a little bit too Catholic. It's got too many rituals that are involved. The Puritans are based on John Calvin, and they're saying, okay, we want to purify the Church of England. We want to make sure it's pure, it's free from the Catholic influence. We don't want it leaning more over to the side of the Catholic Church. So the Puritans are kind of this like hardcore Protestant group of the Anglican Church. Some of these Puritans start to think, okay, it's too late. We can't purify the church, therefore we want to separate it, the separatists. These separatists first move to Holland, and then they're going to start to move to Plymouth. So the Pilgrims who come over are basically Puritan separatists. I know that's a lot of adjectives and nouns and descriptions, and so these Puritan separatists, the people who say we want a clean start, we have certain values, we don't think the English church can adapt to that, we want to separate from it, start anew. Those become the Pilgrims, people on a spiritual pilgrimage to have kind of their own ways. And they set up Plymouth in 1620. The colony of Massachusetts Bay will be set up by Puritans 10 years later in 1630. Those are Puritans. You've got the Pilgrims, so people on the spiritual pilgrimage that set up Plymouth. Both of these places are in the state of Massachusetts today, but it's two separate colonies. So then it talks about the Puritans who are living here, kind of their values, the New England way, the family value, the fact that the Puritans are very, they get kind of a little bit of a bad rap because we think of them as these kind of hardcore extremists, and they are very devoted to their faith. Their faith comes first in their life, but they don't believe, most of them are very intellectual. Um, uh, they will do a lot of reading and writing and really dive into the scriptures. So to be able to read the Bible, they believe in education there. Um, uh, but they also believe that there should be evidence that you're one of God's elect. So a lot of times they'll end up watching each other a little too closely, being a little too strict to say if so and so strays from this, then they must not be one of God's chosen people. The Puritans are up there. They have smaller farms, not the big plantation farm system that we had down in the Chesapeake. And the other thing is that because of the weather, I mean, it's cold most of the time, or most of the winter with frozen ground up in Massachusetts. They just have a much shorter growing season up there. Talks about the Native Americans there, that they get the first Thanksgiving in 1621 as natives like Squanto had assisted the Pilgrims, and so the Pilgrims gave thanks to God for surviving that first rough year where they too had a lot of deaths similar to Jamestown, and gave thanks to the Indians for helping them prevail. And then you had dissension. The Puritans did like to be united. It talks about, on page 82, Roger Williams, man who found Providence in what's now Rhode Island, but a guy who's really, the idea of separation of church and state comes from Roger Williams. He would be kicked out of Massachusetts Bay, but he was one of the first people who was arguing that the church should not be, or the state should not be involved in religious matters. So that idea of the separation of church and state is largely from Roger Williams before he goes on to Providence. And then Anne Hutchinson, a woman, very devoted to hearing God's word, and therefore she starts to hold Bible studies in her home. That becomes controversial when men are starting to come, because the Puritans say men are not supposed to be taught by women. Then there's things that get a little more theological in terms of Arminianism, but it gets into that situation on page 83, and she ends up being kicked out as well, as they talk about the role of God's grace. So she endures terrible fate as her family is murdered by Indians. Speaking of Indian conflicts, you do have difficulties up there. It mentions the Pequot War that occurs. Again, largely over land, like I mentioned before, and that being a problem in trade. So these conflicts that sometimes the groups will get along and sometimes they don't. So the English, as it states in the name of the chapter, they're there to stay. Sometimes it's going to go okay with them, sometimes it's not. You've got the Spanish below, you've got the French above. So they're just kind of hanging out in what will become the United States and growing and expanding, more of a family and religious component in New England and much more of a money gandering component down in the Chesapeake. And that wraps up chapter 3.